as you may have heard us discuss, you still have time to register for events because they go through the 10th, which was Saturday, all the way up through October 18th. And actually, there's a couple follow-ups in January and February. But you can access these events and register for them at www.weekofnonviolence.org. So I just want to give an overview of the Black Women for Positive Change Network. Is active in at least 14 states and DC and has two primary goals: to positively contribute to ideas and methods that can strengthen and expand the American middle working class, with an emphasis on the African American community, and to change the culture of violence in America. And in recognition of Black Women for Positive Change's 9 years of work, they were recently awarded a fundraising grant from Everytown, who's co-hosting and sponsoring this program today. And these funds were primarily used to offer this incredibly important week of quality programming dedicated to promoting empowerment, physical and spiritual healing. So Diane and I, we go back a ways, as I said. She's the local chair of Black Women for Positive Change, and I think that I'd like to say that we have leaned on each other, commiserated with each other, both as members of our organizations and as friends, through all forms of gun violence tragedies, from the cumulative, I would say, harmful impact of the gun violence and resulting trauma in our communities here locally, to the Tree of Life heartbreak that took the lives of 11 on November 18th. So the 2-year anniversary of that is just a few days from now. To the accidental shooting of 3-year-old Chastity Clancy by someone who should never have had a gun. So there's absolutely no excuse for any of these murders and deaths, but the common denominator in all of them is that the perpetrators are being prosecuted by the criminal justice system. And we know this is typically not the case when police are the apparent perpetrators. Pittsburgh, for sure, has its own history of police violence, from the murder of Johnny Gamage in 1995 to the shooting in the back of 17-year-old Antoine Rose by an East Pittsburgh police officer in 2018. Over the decades in our country, there have been thousands of persons whose lives have been taken by police officers under questionable circumstances. A large and very disproportionate percentage of them, as we know, have been persons of color, and those, for the most part, have gone unprosecuted. And we know it was the very, very public murder of George Floyd that seemed to finally turn the tide. So, up to the current time, when I asked Diane how moms could contribute to their week of nonviolence, she suggested a workshop on police reform, which was really perfect timing because Everytown had just published an impressive evidence-based, data-driven platform of recommendations that are essential to restore public confidence in the police as protectors of our safety instead of being part of the problem. So, that brings us to our first presenter. I'm honored to introduce Keegan Mays Williams, who played a large role in the development of these critical recommendations. Keegan currently serves as policy counsel for both the Northeast and Southern regions at Everytown for gun safety. Prior to joining Everytown, she worked as a Manhattan Assistant District Attorney for 10 years. Welcome, Keegan.
Thank you. Or am I going to, are we introducing everyone, or just, I'll get started then? Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank Black Women for Positive Change for inviting me to participate in this panel, and I'm very excited to be here. As Mickey said, my name is Keegan Mays Williams. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And in addition to working in the South and the Northeast, I'm specifically policy counsel in Pennsylvania as well. And so Megan is going to do me the great favor of sharing her screen so that I can walk everyone through. Is there present? Okay, thank you so much. So we can walk through this presentation together. Let's go to the first slide, and it's really going to talk about our goals for this time period. And so we are going to kind of talk about our recommendations for police reform generally, and we are going to talk about how police reform can be modified in Pennsylvania specifically. And we're also going to talk about legislation that has been introduced and what laws have already been passed, as well as at the end go through kind of an overview of which states have already acted to implement laws to reform police interaction with civilians. So number one, first we're going to discuss use of force standards. Number two, we're going to talk about preventative measures so that we are not in a circumstance where force is used in the first place. And number three, we're going to talk about accountability and transparency. So in the case that use of force does occur, what systems do we have in place or should we have in place to make sure that law enforcement officers are held accountable for the harm incurred by excessive use of force. So Megan, can we go to the next slide? So as I said, first we're going to talk about use of force. And we can go to the next slide. So what we're going to start with is we're going to talk about the use of deadly force standards in Pennsylvania. As you can see, there are several different standards for when law enforcement is allowed to legally use deadly force against a civilian in Pennsylvania. One, any force believed to be necessary to defend against bodily harm while making an arrest. And I stress the word believed because what we see here is a subjective standard, meaning that the standard kind of depends on what's going on in the law enforcement officer's mind at the time while they're making the arrest. So that is one of the ways that a police officer can legally use deadly force in Pennsylvania. Another standard is when it's believed that it's necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury. And third, when it is believed that such force is necessary to prevent resistance or escape, and the person has attempted or committed a forcible felony. In Pennsylvania, a forcible felony is a robbery, a burglary, a rape, and some other sexual assault crimes in the code. A police officer is allowed to use deadly force when they believe that someone, that it's necessary to prevent escape or resistance, and they think the person or believe the person has a deadly weapon. And third, a police officer in Pennsylvania can use deadly physical force when they believe that the force is necessary to prevent resistance or escape, and there's an indicator from the person that's being arrested that that person will endanger human life unless they're immediately arrested. The only fourth standard for when a police officer can use deadly force in Pennsylvania is when it's necessary to prevent escape, as we talked about before. But this time we're talking about a circumstance where a person is already in custody, maybe they've already been arrested, or a circumstance where someone is already incarcerated and they try to escape from an institution. That is another circumstance where correctional officers are allowed to use deadly physical force in order to capture someone. So, Megan, if we could go to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about now are what our recommendations are for what use deadly force standards should be. And you are able to kind of compare them to what exists in Pennsylvania now to get a sense of where we think that the Pennsylvania legislature could act to strengthen the standard for use of deadly force. So we believe that it's important to institute and implement a strong legal standard which bars unnecessary police use of force. So, of course, it's appropriate for law enforcement to be able to use deadly force only, in our view, only when it's necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury, and to be careful to use less than lethal force when it's necessary only to make an arrest. So, as you can see in Pennsylvania, that first standard where you're able to use any force that the police officer believes is necessary to effect an arrest, we would think that that standard needs to be a little bit more narrow so that simply trying to make an arrest does not necessarily mean that a person can die from a police officer using more force than necessary to be able to effect the arrest. And further than that, there's like a term, I guess a colloquial term, called the fleeing felon. And it's this idea that if a police officer believes that someone may have committed a felony, that they are allowed to use deadly force in order to stop that person. Now, I think we all understand that sometimes there can be mistaken identity, that there can be circumstances where we just need to understand what the truth is before we use deadly physical force. So for those reasons, it's kind of dangerous to use deadly force for someone who is believed to be a fleeing felon. What we recommend instead is for Pennsylvania to adopt an imminent standard. And the imminent standard basically says that a person has to have a present ability, opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause death or seriously bodily injury to another person. So just to kind of break that down. So unless it is clear that a person is presently able to hurt someone very seriously or kill someone else, that a police officer should use other means to be able to apprehend that person and make sure that they are put through the system and given the same ability to defend themselves in court as everybody else. Further, in order to prevent circumstances where force can end in deadly force, we recommend prohibiting neck restraints. You may have heard about this colloquially used as chokeholds or neck holds in the news. We recommend the prohibition of firing at moving vehicles, using warning shots. We would like to prohibit shooting without warning. So how that plays out is if a police officer feels that there is there's nothing else to do other than to shoot his or her weapon, that a police officer must say at that point, I'm going to use deadly force. And we understand that, many of the circumstances where a police officer feels like they need to use deadly force at all can be very quick. And that police officers often need to make split decisions. And so this can seem like a completely unreasonable request. But we'll talk a little bit about the research later on in the presentation. And this is kind of where possibly additional or different types of training come into place. We'd also, in order to reduce the occurrence of deadly force, restrict the acquisition of military equipment. We understand that the federal government often sells or gives military equipment to local police departments. We would like to restrict that use. And finally, and it has pretty inconsistent implementation depending on where you are, we would like to require the use of body-worn and vehicle-mounted cameras to capture the circumstances where deadly force may have already been used. Megan, can we go to the next slide? So now let's talk about the use of non-deadly force. So I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but this sense of proportionality. So right now in Pennsylvania, I would recommend that there be a statute amended. The use of force statute should be amended in order to require law enforcement to consider proportionality when making an arrest or capturing an arrested person, and to ensure that all reasonable alternatives have been exhausted before even using non-lethal force. And so when we talk about proportionality, there are several factors to consider, which the statute right now does consider partially when it talks about deadly weapons, but we want to talk about, is this a circumstance where someone is simply refusing to comply? Is that a circumstance that should escalate to use of force, or are there other ways to de-escalate a circumstance before leading to a situation where somebody can get gravely injured? And I mean the person that is being arrested, and I also mean the police officer. So thinking of ways to de-escalate the circumstance, but also only using the amount of force necessary in order to place somebody under arrest. And number two, in circumstances where a police officer is using more force than necessary to effect an arrest, we believe that the Pennsylvania legislature, as well as other legislatures, should act to require law enforcement to intervene with their colleagues to make sure that that no one is harmed. Megan, can we go to the next slide? So now we're going to talk about the research, right? So we've talked about what exists in Pennsylvania right now. We've talked about what Everytown suggests should be done instead, but let's talk about why. So the primary takeaway, if you take nothing else out of this presentation, is that implementing stronger use of force policies can save lives, right? And that's why we're in this movement, to save as many lives as possible. A 2016 study of 91 large police departments found that use of force reforms reduced police killings. And as you can see on the slide, you can see all of the ways, excuse me, my computer is giving me reminders. You can see all of the ways that police killings have been reduced. When a police officer has made sure to exhaust all of the means, and that is to use non-deadly physical force before effecting an arrest, that has led to a 25% reduction. When there is a ban on chokeholds, there is a 22% reduction in police killings. When police officers are legally required to intervene to prevent the death of another, there's a 9% reduction. When police officers are prohibited from shooting at moving vehicles, you can see that there's an 8% reduction in deaths. And when a police officer is able to offer a warning before shooting, you'll see that there is a 5% reduction. And that might seem like a pretty small percentage, but that is a different person's life. So I think that we can all agree that we are in favor of anything that can save a life. So now, Megan, if we can go to the next slide. Let's talk about what legislation has been introduced in Pennsylvania with regard to the use of deadly force so far. This session, HB 1910, which basically called for increasing training of law enforcement officers on the proper use of deadly force, was actually signed by Governor Wolf this past summer, as many of you may be aware. So, I mean, this, from what I understand of this new law, this kind of requires law enforcement agencies to develop their own use of force standards. I think it seems as though it can vary from department to department. So depending on the department, I guess, lets us know whether we may see a decrease. But I think just even having a policy at all where there is a standard with which police officers are expected to comply with in order to be considered to be doing their job effectively is a step in the right direction. Then there was also SB 1205, and that bill requires all law enforcement agencies to develop use of force policies and trainings, and also to ban chokeholds and other neck restraints. But this bill says that you can actually use chokeholds and neck restraints if deadly force is required. So kind of allowing it and then backpedaling it. This bill was passed through the Senate. However, it is currently stalled in the House Judiciary Committee. And as you all know, this session will end on November 30th. So we will see if this bill is refiled in after the election. Megan, if we could go to the next slide. So now let's talk about use of force transparency recommendations, what to do so that we know more about when use of force is used, who's using it, who's being used against, and what can we do to make sure that the public, as well as the police officers who work for the departments, are all aware of the standards and what should happen when force is used. So the first recommendation is that the Pennsylvania legislature should act to require police officers to report to their departments any uses of forces, any threats of use of force, and any attempted uses of force. And when they report this data, it should include demographic markers for the individuals for which the force was used against. And the data should be reviewed as a routine executive crime statistic meeting. In New York, we call this ComStat, but it should be reviewed by leadership to see if there is a trend, to see if there's any ways that maybe use of force policy should be amended. And it should also be shared with problem-solving groups, maybe community problem-solving groups that can help police department if there is a particular high occurrence of use of force in any particular department. This session, SB 459 was introduced, and this bill proposed that law enforcement agencies should adopt use of force policies and would require law enforcement officers to keep records of all uses of force, including deadly physical force. And this also passed through the Senate, though it is currently stalled in the House Judiciary Committee. Number two, the second recommendation for transparency with regard to use of force would be to require agencies to record and publish data on the use of force incidents. So in the first part, we're requiring individual law enforcement officers to report any uses of force either observed or force that they themselves participated in. And the second step is to also require the agencies as a whole to record and publish this data on use of force incidents, and not only to report it out to federal authorities, but also to create a public-facing dashboard so that the public can also see what the department that is meant to serve them, what their statistics are, and how force is being used internally. And right now in the status quo, should an individual want to know more about the use of force within a department, at least in Pennsylvania right now, and in many other states, an individual or an organization is required to use the Freedom of Information laws in order to get that information. So the proposal is that that information should be readily available. Of course, pending, there would be different rules if there was an ongoing investigation, but largely to make sure that everyone understands how different departments are using force and the statistics thereof. Now, smaller departments should also be tracking and maintaining this type of data in a way that's easily accessible to the public, even if they don't have enough statistics that are as meaningful for a dashboard. There should be some mechanism to make sure that the community knows about the use of force incidents in their home area. All right. Number two. So first we talked about use of force standards, the recommendations that we have where Pennsylvania is now, and bills that have been introduced and laws that have been passed. But now let's talk about preventative measures and those recommendations. Okay, Megan, can we go to the next slide? So first, training is a larger umbrella. And let's talk about de-escalation training. And we know that it exists in many police departments, including in Pennsylvania. But what we want to talk about today is what the substantive content of the de-escalation training should be. And this is going to be a recurring theme. We should be thinking about data collection to make sure that we have a full understanding of the implementation of the training and its effectiveness. And three, this is just to kind of let you guys know other organizations that also endorse the idea of de-escalation training. So training content. De-escalation training should emphasize communication, active listening, observation statements. There should be strategies to increase a police officer's understanding and so they can ask questions to avoid assumptions. There should be training on behaviors to avoid. There should be role playing. There should be role playing which shows different crisis levels because of course not all incidents are at a level 10. Some may start at a level 5 and it's important to recognize that. And also training should offer feedback from experts. So number 2, data collection. Departments should be collecting data to assess the training's impact on the actual outcomes. So it's one thing to do the trainings, but it's really important to know whether or not the trainings are effective, right? And we would also like to understand by collecting data such as citations, paperwork as to arrests. We should start collecting data about successfully de-escalated circumstances on the street. Of course, collecting data about when use of force is actually used as a last case scenario. We should be collecting data about complaints, and we should have an idea of which demographics are largely complaining. But we should also be collecting data about police officer injuries and their own fatalities. And we would support more research into the effectiveness of scenario-based training. We understand that scenario-based training has been done many times, but we should understand more about it because, it is probably very difficult to reproduce the feeling of being worried and the adrenaline going through any particular police officer's body at a time during an encounter with an individual. So we should understand more about whether scenario-based training is truly effective and figure out what is most effective in order to make sure that more lives are saved and police shootings are reduced. And number 3, de-escalating and crisis intervention training are endorsed by the Police Executive Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, as well as the Obama Task Force of 21st Century Policing. Megan, can we go to the next slide? The other type of training is bias training. So we recommend that police officers should have mandatory training on interacting with individuals from vulnerable and disproportionately impacted populations, and this should include racial bias training. This training should not just be offered once, it should be offered during basic training as well as offered as continuing education. We would also support further research into the effectiveness of implicit bias training and would encourage departments to collect data on the outcomes of this training on use of force incidents and complaints by different demographics. And number 2, departments should have proactive and regular engagement with LGBTQIA groups, racial and religious marginalized communities, and there should be a commitment to procedural justice principles that emphasize community voice. And that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about procedural justice. Megan, can we go to the next slide? So procedural justice. This is the concept that police agencies should adopt explicit policies on how police officers interact with the communities that they serve. And the focus should be on building legitimacy and trust within communities. And it's pretty important that these policies not just live internally, but that these policies be public, and that the impacted community members should have an understanding of what the policy review process is, which could hopefully create more buy-in to the policies as they exist. Now, this should also include continuous notifications when policies change. This should include accepting input from the community as to how policies are constructed. And it should also lead to building of community advisory groups. Again, the theme is data collection. We should also be tracking the progress of prioritizing community trust and reward officers that model good behavior, and of course, the inverse for officers who do not. And this can include working with community-based organizations that can conduct surveys and evaluate the police-community relationships. From what I understand, and you know, I do not live in Pennsylvania. I did go to college in Pennsylvania, but I do not live in Pennsylvania. So please feel free to, during the question and answer period, let me know if there are other examples of procedural justice happening in Pennsylvania right now. But from what I understand, the Public Safety Task Force of the Pennsylvania Interfaith Impact Network has sponsored procedural justice workshop for the Pittsburgh Police Department. And that this training is a result of a program from DOJ, from the Federal Justice Department. And Pittsburgh was chosen as one of 6 pilot cities for the program. And I think the training program is similar throughout the state, is issued by the Municipal Police Officers Education and Training Commission. The only issue is I think these procedural justice trainings are optional rather than mandatory. So we would recommend that it be mandatory. And finally, for an emphasis on, for police departments with an emphasis on procedural justice, we should expand police departments to collaborate with social workers, clinicians, and other credible messengers to help mitigate conflicts and respond to crises in the context that mandate law enforcement response. So there is a crisis intervention team model that exists in almost every state. My understanding is that training is completely voluntary. But the model is about pairing police officer responses with a mental health professional response. And it's supposed to help law enforcement de-escalate conflicts whenever possible, and instead connect people with mental health services and kind of whenever possible to divert them from the criminal justice system altogether. I'm sure you guys have seen in the paper that several cities, I think I read yesterday that Philadelphia is starting a pilot program where they may actually have a mental health professional sitting in maybe the dispatch, the 911 dispatch center right now to help to deal with issues where someone experiencing a mental health episode can be met, police officers can seek the advice of mental health professionals and hopefully de-escalate circumstances. Governor Wolf signed HB 1910 last summer, and this legislation implements new and annual de-escalation and harm reduction strategies training. And it also requires community and cultural awareness, implicit bias, procedural justice, and reconciliation technique training every other year. So the de-escalation training is every year, and the training that helps officers with their awareness of the communities that they serve is offered every other year. Currently, the Pennsylvania State Police has an early intervention program which identifies troopers who may need additional training and or supervision. And the primary goal of this early intervention program is to stop potential misconduct before it occurs. And so it basically works by, after receiving complaints against these troopers for excessive force or other misconduct, that conduct is investigated by the Internal Affairs Division of the Bureau of Integrity and Professional Standards. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of transparency in this process. The individual disciplinary actions are confidential, and they vary based on the nature of the complaint and the outcome of the internal investigation. So I would also recommend that the Pennsylvania legislature should act to review local police departments with troubling records. And this is a system that already exists at the federal level and can be implemented. Okay, and so the third and final area that we're going to discuss today is largely the accountability and transparency recommendations in the circumstance where we aren't able to prevent the use of force, that we, by trainings, by enacting procedural justice, what can we do to make sure that law enforcement officers are held responsible for their behavior? And Megan, if we could go to the next slide. So civilian review boards. So we should be using external oversight boards to ensure appropriate discipline for police misconduct and use of force. And so I'm sure that you all have been paying attention to the news and the different critiques of civilian review boards. So I've also laid out our recommendations for what a civilian review board should look like, because there are many civilian review boards that exist, but there are many critiques, such as it's not necessarily comprised of the community. It's not really a civilian board, and that many times the civilian review board doesn't have as much power as it needs to have in order to actually be effective. So some of our recommendations are, number one, that if a civilian review board exists, it should be able to independently investigate civilian complaints against the police officers. Right now, a lot of civilian review boards are only given the authority to review findings of internal police investigations that have already been completed, or they're able to appeal findings of those investigations. But we recommend that the civilian review boards should be able to get the exact same evidence that a police department would get, so that they can be able to review and make their own evaluation and determine their own findings, rather than only receiving what a police department would want them to have. Two, to the same vein, civilian review boards should be able to issue subpoenas. And the subpoena should work for things, for documents, internal records, surveillance footage, as well as they should have some subpoena power to make sure that witnesses are able to testify before them under oath. Number three, once the civilian review board is able to review evidence and able to speak to witnesses, they should be able to make binding find of facts on discipline decisions. So it's true that many police departments would likely want to retain their ability to discipline their own staff members, but a really impactful board would have the authority to make the findings binding on the police, and then have ultimately the internal police department, based on those facts, institute and implement an actual punishment that is within the matrix of a pre-arranged and a pre-negotiated list of potential punishments. Number four, civilian review boards should be able to make formal recommendations to police departments. And so this is to the extent that after this use of force incident has been investigated, and after the binding facts have been disseminated and shared, these boards should have some sort of power to actually make different policy for the departments, or at least offer different policies that can make sure to prevent future incidents where use of force was used, or to make sure that these acts of misconduct do not reoccur. And number 5, civilian review boards should be as localized as possible, because they are most effective when they're composed of and led by local communities and police departments. That said, it's still, in our view, important for there to also be a state civilian review board in the case where you have a local civilian review board that's either ineffective because they're not given the influence and power that they need, but also if they're unwilling to do the job that the community needs them to do. There should be some state oversight to step in and make sure that all communities are able to receive justice when excessive use of force or misconduct by police officers does happen. Again, I am not, I do not live in Pennsylvania, so I'm sure other people have more examples. I understand that there is currently a Pittsburgh Citizen Police Review Board, which can hold disciplinary hearings, which can lead to advisory recommendations to Pittsburgh police chiefs. But unfortunately, the law enforcement officers are not obligated to cooperate with the board. I understand that there's also a police review board in Philadelphia, but I think that there are also some critiques about the influence and power of that board as well. Last summer, HB 2691 was introduced, and that bill proposed to introduce a county independent Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board, and this board would receive complaints. It would have the ability to investigate. It would make police misconduct recommendations. They would be able to conduct public hearings, subpoena witnesses, compel witness attendance, ensure that these police officers were testifying under oath, and they could require the production of evidence to matters that are beyond the scope of a particular investigation. So for example, if a police officer had other incidents of use of force, that might be relevant to their investigation, and they should have this bill calls for their ability to be able to see all of the information. The critiques of this bill are that the law enforcement agencies would still retain the ability to set the disciplinary policy, and all of the recommendations would remain advisory. And this bill is still in the House Judiciary Committee where after it was introduced, so it has not moved at all. And finally, and thank you for all staying with me here, I know I've been talking for quite some time, special prosecutors in order to increase accountability and transparency. We would recommend that local district attorneys who work closely with police departments should not be used to investigate use of force incidents, either because of a real conflict of interest. As a former prosecutor myself, you have cases often, you have the same police officers or the same detectives working on similar cases. And as you mature in the office and you get bigger cases, you might work with the same detective. You may be working with the same detective for years. And that would make it really difficult for an individual person to remain objective about an investigation should that detective be under investigation. So it's important that maybe a neighboring DA's office take on the investigation, or the state attorney general could be the alternate prosecutor in order to make a decision as to whether a police officer's conduct rises to the level of excessive use of force or misconduct. Right now in Pennsylvania, there is a process by which a judicial panel can appoint independent counsel upon a district attorney's request to investigate the attorney general and people who work closely with the attorney general. But currently, there is no process that exists to investigate use of force incidents with local law enforcement. There was actually legislation proposed by Senator Haywood. It's SB 611. And the bill proposes that the Office of the Attorney General should be used to investigate use of force incidents when a person dies and determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. I'd recommend that this office be used to investigate less than lethal incidents of use of force. And finally, I just wanted to briefly let you all know other places in the country that have, my cat, sorry, she's singing to everyone. There are other states in this country who have acted upon this, the call for police reform. So we can see that in Connecticut, Colorado, Minnesota, and Nevada, the use of force standards have been strengthened. In Connecticut, Minnesota, and New York, independent investigatory processes, whether it be a special prosecutor, but those processes have been established in those states. Connecticut has acted to make sure that local police departments are restricted from receiving military equipment. In Colorado and New Mexico, there are improving standards about, excuse me, everyone, I've been talking for quite some time. We've been improving the transparency on use of force incidents and officer misconduct. In Minnesota and Nevada, police officers are required to intervene where a colleague may be using excessive force. And finally, in Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, chokeholds and other neck restraints have been prohibited. And finally, if there are any questions, I am happy to answer them.
I don't have any question, Keegan, but just a couple things jumped out at me as you were presenting. One, when you were talking about the fleeing felon, and if there were laws on the books that there had to be an imminent danger present and that the alleged perpetrator had to have the ability to actually inflict harm on somebody, it just struck me that I don't want to say that Antoine Rose would be alive today, but it seems like there would have been a better chance that the officer who killed him would have been found guilty of something.
It's really hard for me to say in a vacuum. I regret to say that I don't know as many facts as I should about the Antoine Rose incident to make an assessment. But I can definitely look into that and circle back with you on that answer, but I'm not sure at the moment.
Okay. And when you were talking about training, I just feel like I want to point this out. Black Women for Positive Change sponsored a series of implicit bias training several years ago. That was really dedicated to the Pittsburgh police. And my understanding was that part of that was a result of that we were one of the pilots. So, I'm not sure how well that went. And I also want to note that and Richard Garland and I were talking about this. I attended like a Noble workshop several months ago, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. And there were representatives there from several cities. in which part of police training involved actually the community members came and spoke with police officers about their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a one-shot deal. Like, new recruits had to actually literally walk around the neighborhood with community members, and
Mm-hmm.
that just struck me. I just feel like that would probably go a long way, you know.
Yeah, that sounds like some of the procedural justice work that we were thinking about, truly investing in communities and really getting to know the communities. That sounds right.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, I just wanted to kind of point out and I wanted to ask you one. Those authorities that civilian review boards should have,
Mm-hmm.
sounded like they should have all of those authorities. And I'm just wondering if any of them have any of those authorities.
There are definitely civilian review boards that have some of those recommendations. I don't know that any review board has all of them. I have done a little bit of work with the New York Civilian Review Board during my investigations at the DA's office, but I'm not, obviously as the prosecutor, I was able to subpoena documents, but I have to be honest that I'm not quite sure whether the review board was able to subpoena documents, but I think they are in New York. That said, I am seeing a lot of legislation in a lot of different states, Delaware and Kentucky. There are several places that are seeking to have advisory committees to learn more about the best way to construct a civilian review board. So while they may not exist today, and I'm not certain, I do believe that a lot of different communities are pushing for that legislation in different states.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Right. So we kind of planned this workshop in that we would have a more formal presentation from a lawyer to kind of update us on what's going on around the country. Our second presenter is going to be Doris Lee, who's going to tell her personal story. And then our final presenter is Richard Garland, who actually is on our mayor's task force on police reform. And we'll hear from Richard at the end. But now it's time to hear a very important we're going to hear Doris's story. So I want to let you know that she was born and raised in Denver. She's one of 9 children and a proud aunt, great aunt, and great aunt, listen to this, of over 200, including Elijah McClain, who was, as we know, suffocated by police in Aurora, Colorado. And I think you could disagree with me, Doris, but I think this is pretty much the reason why Doris is here with us today. She earned her undergraduate degree in business management, has a master's of science in quality systems management. She enjoyed a 36-year career in corporate America in the areas of customer service, trade marketing, and sales in many cities throughout the country, in which her professional career ended in Houston, Texas. She retired in 2012. Her passions are reading, traveling, volunteering, like no kidding, Doris, being a voiceover artist, curious to hear about that, and activism, also pretty obvious. So it was the horrific murder of her great nephew, Elijah McClain, that brought her to both Black Women for Positive Change and Moms Demand Action. Doris will share her personal journey since the horrific murder of this gentle, generous, and talented young man. Doris is going to share her personal journey with you. Thank you, Doris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mickey. And Keegan, I wanted to thank you for your presentation as well, because it's very important as we really try to focus on police reform across the country. I want to thank Everytown and Mom Demand Action for sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank Diane Powell and Black Women for Positive Change for including me on this forum. I do want to start because one of the things I was asked to do is just kind of talk about the impact of the legislation in Colorado. I do want to begin by thanking all of those that were instrumental in ensuring that that law passed. It started with my niece, Shanine McClain, who is the mother of Elijah McClain, and she had the courage to testify in front of the Colorado State Senate on behalf of her son. I want to thank her lawyer, Mari Newman, who played an instrumental role in the writing and the passage of that bill. And then also the legislators who championed the bill. State Representative Leslie Herod, Representative Serena Gonzalez Gutierrez, State Senator Leroy Garcia, and State Senator Rhonda Fields. They were very instrumental, all of those, in making sure that that bill passed. But I also want to really show my appreciation for the governor, Jared Polis, who signed the bill into law on June 19th, 2020. And that's so relevant because June 19th is considered, is also named Juneteenth, which is a very important holiday in the Black community. So there's a phrase right underneath that there's a phrase right above the governor's signature, and it states, "The General Assembly hereby finds, determines, and declares that this act is necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, and safety." And as it relates to that particular law, SB 217, most of it is effective immediately. And so that means that that law goes into effect immediately. There's a couple of provisions. There's some reporting that goes into effect 2022, and then body cameras for the entire state goes into effect 2023, but the majority of the law goes into effect immediately. As I think most of you know, my nephew Elijah McClain was attacked by police on August the 24th, 2019. It was literally unprovoked. Someone called and said that he was acting strangely. He was just walking to the store with his earphones in, enjoying his life. He was an introvert. He was a beautiful soul, self-taught artist, self-taught violinist, and just doing his own thing at 10:30 at night. He was even seen on video just prior to the attack. And someone called and said he was acting strangely because he was walking, enjoying life. How about that? And as a result of that, he lost his life. And he, as George Floyd said, he said over many times, "I can't breathe." That at one point, all three of those officers were on his 140-pound body at the same time. There is no excuse for that. And my great nephew, I call him grandnephew because he's my sister's grandson, but my great nephew died as a result of just not being, just obviously being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One thing that I think is important to also note is that the Denver Post, which is Denver's or Colorado's largest newspaper, states that Colorado's law enforcement is among the most brutal. This is a small state. Colorado's not a large state. One of the most brutal in the nation. And taxpayers have paid millions of dollars in excessive force verdicts up through 2017. And my nephew was murdered in 2019. So just imagine, so nothing has changed in essence. It just makes me so upset. But the law has been passed, and that gives me hope, if nothing else, even though there's still a lot of work to be done. Because in order for that law to work, the people responsible for enforcing it has to do so, and they have to hold people that violate the law accountable, meaning police officers accountable for their actions. But to date, it's still happening. And I'll give you 3 examples. On June 27th, there was a peaceful protest which included a violin vigil on behalf of my nephew, Elijah McClain, because I don't know if you know this or not. I didn't know it until I found out on social media that my nephew was a self-taught violinist.
Get out the screen.
He's a self-taught violinist. And he was also a trained massage therapist. And on his breaks as a massage therapist, he would go across the street and play the violin for kittens in a shelter. How incredible is that? When I found that out, I just fell in love with him all over again because I never knew that. He really was a peaceful young man. And a young man named Lee England Jr., who lives in New York City, who is a professional violinist, found out about my nephew's story, and he organized this violin vigil on June 27th in Aurora, Colorado, to honor my nephew. And police showed up in riot gear. Why would you show up in riot gear? You're already showing their implicit bias. They showed up in riot gear, and there may have been a couple of people that said things that they shouldn't have to the police, but there was no physical violence, and the police started to spray mace on the crowd, and the crowd purposefully shielded the violinist because they didn't want them to stop playing. And so they were hit by mace because they wanted to protect the violinist. There's no excuse for that. And the reason I believe that that it was excessive is because when lawyers heard the story, they filed suit on the police. And I'll give you another example. July 25th, a large group, very large group, were protesting on behalf of Elijah McClain on Highway 225, a major highway in Aurora, and it was authorized, and the entrances were blocked off. A Jeep driven by a white guy got through the barricade and started barreling towards this crowd of people. And the crowd was diverse. It wasn't a black crowd. It wasn't a white crowd. It was a diverse crowd. The crowd, this Jeep started barreling towards the crowd. A man who felt that there was going to be carnage intercepted the Jeep and purposefully ran into the Jeep so that the crowd would have time to disperse. And you could see in a video that even though the crowd had time to disperse, that Jeep was still going very fast. Took the exit, and when he took the exit, he saw cops and stopped and talked to the cops and told his version of what happened. And so the cops did impound the Jeep for evidentiary purposes, but drove the guy home. And when people that thought their lives were in danger told their story to these cops, in my opinion, implicit bias and racial bias took hold again, because the guy in the Jeep is not going to be prosecuted because they say they don't have enough evidence. There are witnesses who would have died if that truck had not intervened, but that's not enough evidence. So he's not going to be charged, which is very upsetting to me. But and if that wasn't bad enough, the worst that I've heard so far is on August the 2nd, a mother named Brittany Gilliam, her 12-year-old sister, two nieces, 14 and 17, and her daughter, 6 years old, went out for a day together in their SUV, and they are parked in a parking lot. And all of a sudden, they are surrounded by Aurora Police Department, guns drawn. There's one adult in this car. There's 5 people in this car, one adult. 5 people, 4 of them 6 to 17 years old. The police surround the car, guns drawn, force them out of the car, face down on the ground. They had a 6-year-old child face down on a ground, concrete, 90-degree weather. There is no excuse for that. I don't care what protocol is. because they said, and the chief of police, who is named Vanessa Wilson, she justified it by saying that protocol is if, well, the reason they said they did it was because they thought, listen to me carefully, they thought that the car they were in was stolen, okay? And they said that, and so the chief of police said that protocol is, if the car is stolen, then they are to treat it as one of the things Keegan said, you know, as imminent danger, or, you know, or they wanted to make sure that the cops are protected. You have 5 women, first of all, 5 women. I mean, no, 5 females, 1 adult, and a 6-year-old baby. You force them out of the car and to the ground. That baby is on video screaming for her mother. They handcuff the mother and the oldest niece. And in the pictures that you see, there's 3 or 4 police officers. So there's at least 2 cars there. You can't tell me that you can't take those children and put them in cars until you figure it out. But here's the most egregious part of this whole thing. The only thing that was consistent was the numbers on the license plate. The only thing that was consistent. And nobody on this earth will ever convince me that if you are told that there's a stolen car, you are told the make and the model. The car that they said was stolen was a motorcycle. This family was in a SUV. The vehicle that was stolen was a Montana plate. This was a Colorado plate. Tell me if that's not racial bias. Tell me. I will argue with anyone. That is unacceptable. It is and somebody could have died. What, somebody could have died. But they had a 6-year-old baby on the ground. There's no excuse. To me, that's insane. And it's not acceptable. And it should not be acceptable. To me, that is incompetence. Those police officers, in my opinion, should have been immediately fired. I don't want to hear your thoughts and prayers. I want to see action. Chief of police, I want to see action. You're saying that you're getting them mental health. No, you need to do something internally, because there's something internally wrong with your department, obviously. So, do I think that SB 217 have meat and it can make a difference? I absolutely do. But let me restate it again. The law will only work if the people responsible for it enforce it and hold the people that are not doing right accountable for their actions. Because when all these 3 happened, it was after that law was signed into law. It was after that measure was signed into law. And these things are still happening. So as Keegan said, their training is necessary. Obviously, they haven't even been they haven't been given details about the law, nor have they implemented it. And that's unacceptable. It really is. So there's a lot of work to be done. I absolutely believe. So in closing, I would encourage everyone to continue to say Elijah McClain's name. Make sure that it is that awareness. We just can't afford not to talk about these things, because it is so important that we have change. And it's so important that, and I tell this to my family, my friends, my colleagues, everyone in Colorado, continue to do what you're doing. But I'm asking the country to do this, and I'm asking the world to continue to do it, because I have been overwhelmed with the awareness that that has happened, unfortunately, because of George Floyd's death. But it resurged the awareness of my nephew above anything I could expect. Because when it happened to him in 2019, I wrote letters to every media outlet, and not one response nationally, not one response outside of the state of Colorado. And then fast forward George Floyd, And my nephew's name is a household name now. And I thank God for that. I truly do, because that's what I wanted last year, because I want justice. I want the people, the perpetrators that killed him, I want them incarcerated, because that's where they need to be. And examples need to be made, because if you don't hold them accountable, their behavior is not going to change. It's not going to change. So please continue to say his name, continue to say everyone's name that's been impacted by implied bias and racial discrimination, because that is going to help affect change. And a group that I know is doing that is an organization, the creators of what's called Say Their Name Memorial. And Megan, if you could put that the first screen up, I'd appreciate it. They're called they're, believe it or not, they're out of Portland, Oregon, but it's a family named Joy and Elise Proctor, and they created the Say Their Name Memorial. They are advocating on behalf of those impacted by racism. It's a nationwide initiative to honor Black lives taken by systemic racism and racial injustice. The memorial was created, as I indicated, in Portland, Oregon, and it was created on Juneteenth. The first one was presented on Juneteenth 2020, and it's been displayed in over 25 locations nationwide. And believe it or not, you can turn to the next one, please. They just left Houston yesterday, and I had the privilege to go visit it on Thursday of last week. You can go to the next one, please. And that is my nephew, Elijah McClain. Next one, please. And you can go to the next one. And it was an honor to have the opportunity to be there. And as fate would have it, this young lady in the gray is George Floyd's aunt. And the only reason I had the opportunity to meet her is because there was somebody directing us because of COVID-19 and social distancing. They wanted us to, make sure that we enter at the front end and exit at the back. So they were providing directions. And I explained to them the reason I was there, mainly because my grandnephew, Elijah McClain, was murdered by police. And she said, "You're not going to believe this, but George Floyd's aunt is here." And so I made sure that I introduced myself to her. Unfortunately, we have something in common, and I will stay in touch with her, and hopefully we can do some forums together to continue to advocate on our family's behalf and to help affect change. They do produce traveling memorials. I don't know where it's going next for public exhibition, but they also work, they're starting to work with communities to create grassroots memorials that are stationary in different neighborhoods. Their vision is to facilitate conversation around systemic racism while honoring those whose lives have been taken by it. If you have the opportunity, if you hear one in your town, I promise you it's worth going to see. And on that note, I do want to thank you for allowing me to tell my story and advocate on behalf of my grandnephew, Elijah McClain.
Thank you, Doris. This is Diane Powell. Nikki is experiencing a little technical difficulty with her computer, so I'll take over from here.
Diane,
Yes.
I'm back. I just can't figure out how to get my face on there. Thank you.
Okay.
I was panically texting many people. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Doris, for your profound story. And, it just seems pretty obvious that, laws are no good unless they're implemented. And we certainly have a part to play, both Black Women for Positive Change as well as Moms Demand Action in that particular aspect, for sure. All right, it's my pleasure now to introduce my fellow social worker friend, Richard Garland. His research centers on working with troubled youth, especially those involved in gangs and gun violence. He has an interesting perspective in that Richard does work with police departments as part of his job on occasion, and he also works closely with community-based organizations throughout the Commonwealth, providing gun violence education and training. He is director, and this is a mouthful, Richard, he is director of the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health's Behavior and Community Health Center for Health Equity Violence Prevention Project. And there he oversees training, data collection, and outreach efforts aimed at reducing crime and violence. The center also conducts hospital-based intervention programs where gunshot wound victims receiving treatment in our major local trauma centers here in Pittsburgh. They're counseled in an effort to reduce recidivism. The project provides case management services to attempt to alter the lifestyle of the victims with the goal of preventing further involvement with crime and violence. Richard is a member of Pittsburgh's Mayor's Task Force on Police Reform. He'll discuss the process of working on the forthcoming recommendations, which we hear is maybe next week. Those recommendations are going to be published. And, because Richard does have some unique perspectives, I also invite him to offer any other insights he thinks are relevant to this discussion. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. I want to thank Keegan and Doris for your presentation. They were awesome. So the one thing of being on this Mayor's Reforms Task Force, I felt like I was kind of the squeaky wheel as well as a lot of other people were. But Keegan, some of the things that you brought out that we talked about was use of force, de-escalation training, right? How officers, making sure that officers don't just stand by when they see another officer that's overzealous, and stepping in. The one thing that you said, Keegan, that I'm kind of really frustrated about is when we talk about the Citizen Police Review Board. They have no use whatsoever here in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. Well, in Allegheny County, they're trying to get a civilian police review board. But the sad thing about our review board is that the Fraternal Order of Police, they are strong. They can make recommendations to get rid of some officers, but the union usually comes back and they get their job back. And the chief of police has no recourse. He has to get them bad apples back. So that's my frustration with the Citizen Police Review Board, that they have no legs. And even on this Mayor's Task Force, that was one of the my biggest concern was that we're only talking about Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is surrounded by at least 130 other municipalities where they have a lot of different police forces. And you can't just do one, just the city of Pittsburgh, think about the city of Pittsburgh and not address the issues of what's going on in these municipalities. Because we have a real transient population here in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, where we've had different housing communities closed, and people move from the city to the county, from the county to the city. We can talk about gentrification, and the closing of housing authorities. I work with a population that a lot of people don't want to work with. I work in the hood, just to be clear. Trying to address the violence that is happening in our communities. And unfortunately, one of my programs is I review all the homicides in Allegheny County. Uh, Over 90% of the homicides in our communities um, is young African American males. Um, Through our research for the last couple of years, we've seen an uptick in young women being killed. Um, and it's not so much domestic violence related, but those are issues that we are seeing every day. Reviewing the homicides, we look at the trends and looking at the trends and how they peak and how um, things have really fluctuated. Usually in the city of Pittsburgh, we have more homicides. In the last 4 years, the county has had more homicides than the city of Pittsburgh. So you can't just address one part of just the city of Pittsburgh. You have to address all the other outlying counties as well. And that is one of the things that I was very outspoken with while I was on this mayor's task force. And there were some really good people. I'm so glad to hear your presentation, Keegan, on at the state level when we talk about the de-escalation training. This Pittsburgh Police needs a lot more training. There are a couple programs that I'm working with. Liz Miller has this program called Creating Peace, where young men are talking to police officers, the ones that are going through training right now, uh, so that they can understand the things that are going on, not only in the community, but understand how young people think. And one of the things that I think that my organization, being at the University of Pittsburgh, that we lack in is the Graduate School of Public Health is a research-based organization. They want to do research. Um, you have to understand the complexity of the community. Stats has a way of lulling us to sleep. If me as a social worker, as Mickey always talks about me, we like getting our hands dirty. We like being in the mix, so that we can understand not only the complexity of the community, but what are the drivers in the community. I think that's the most important thing. Um, and just a little bit of background about myself. I'll come to Pittsburgh, but I'm originally from Philadelphia. I myself am a former gang member from Philadelphia. Of course, of my involvement in gangs, drugs, and alcohol, I spent over 23 and a half years of my life in the criminal justice system. Um, I left Western Penitentiary August 21st, 1991. Um, and part of my stipulation for parole was I don't go back to Philadelphia. That's how I ended up here in Pittsburgh. During in the early 90s, we had a real bad gang problem. And one of the things that helped me address a lot of the issues here in Pittsburgh was when I was down Western Penitentiary, I used to take pictures in the visiting room. So many kids who came to see their mom, their dads or cousins or anything, they would see me in the visiting room. And I used to have long dreadlocks because I'm a supporter of the MOVE organization. That enabled me to, when I did get out and addressing this gang problem, they used to come to me and said, go get the guy with the dreads. He understands where we at. And that's how I began my relationship with not only the community, but I established a relationship with Pittsburgh Police. I think in 1996, I trained all of Pittsburgh police officers on understanding youth gangs. And this was at the onset of all the gang stuff. I can tell you that a lot of these officers didn't have a clue. Um, Now, that's how I began a relationship with them. Because they would stop me at times and say, could you talk to these kids? These kids is, because it wasn't about so much locking them up. But you know, that that was a way for me to broker a lot of different things in different communities, and there was many other folks who worked with me who brokered a lot of truces. And I was kind of surprised when the mayor asked me to be on this police reform task force, because just like I just gave you some of my past, I would be the last person that you would think that they would ask to be on this task force. And the thing that is really really telling to me is I thought I would be more against the police. You know, I sounded more pro-police on this freaking task force than I did against the police, which is surprising to me. Because we know we got some bad apples, and the thing that bystander officers that stand by when they see other officers doing wrong, you know, we had to address that. We had to address the culture. The culture is the most, I think, the largest thing that we had to address in any police department, you know, because there are police cliques where they talk about they bleed blue. You know, that's what they, you know, it's them against the world. And we can't have, that's a gang mentality. We can't have that kind of mentality in a police force. Um, Teaching them, you know, more, I agree, more training, de-escalation. Um, we have a police force here in Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh. Over 85% of the police force is white, and most of the communities that they serve are African American. Um, Now they have had a push to try to get more minorities in. Um, but you know, I can remember when I was coming up, when you would ask a kid what do they want to be when they grow up, they would say a police officer. That is not what they say today. Um, you know, so education and recruitment of more minorities, and especially women. Some of the women police officers, um, they are they are not part of the clique of what we have in certain police departments. So, you know, the training, we can't do enough training, you know, to get people to understand what it is to be a police officer. I think um, for me, you know, it's really hard to um, break up this clique when we talk about this culture that we know exists of the bad police officers that we need to get rid of. I also really need to um, think about this citizen police review board and give it real legs, because this fraternal order of police here is so strong that this union, they don't have no choice in hiring back bad officers. We, you know, we also addressed issues where police officers from other departments would get fired and they would come to the Pittsburgh Police and they would be hired. We, you know, we wanted to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. The whole Anton Rose killing of Anton Rose was this police officer came from, he was in a couple of, he was with the Pittsburgh um, University of Pittsburgh Police and got fired from there. And then he went to East Pittsburgh, and this is when he ended up killing Antoine Rose. Uh, if if other police departments would have known that this guy was fired, he should have never gotten hired at East Pittsburgh. Um, so we had to have a whole lot more documentation when we talk about hiring people from other districts. We need to know why they were leaving those districts, especially if they were under investigation for doing something wrong. Um, those are the things that we try to address in our report. But I really am I'm really forceful that we have to talk about all of Allegheny County. We just can't talk about the city of Pittsburgh. Um, and the laws have to reflect that, because most of these municipalities, police officers, they don't have none of the trainings that we talked about, especially what you talked about, Keegan, um, in their department. Nothing around, they might do an hour de-escalation, and it's something that should be done all the time. We also really need to talk about cultural awareness. Um, and one of the things is, with the environment that we're in today, I never thought I would be one to talk about that. People need to understand this LGBTQ community, the different environments that exist, and the different people that exist in the communities that they serve. Um, but it's really hard when you have a police officer who comes from the suburbs and he works in the community, Black and brown communities, that he has never had any relationship with at all. So there's so much cultural awareness that has to be done, not only in Pittsburgh but throughout this system. Um, and I can tell you that we were really hard on officers that just sit back and let other officers do what they do. And then there's some Black officers that, will step back and won't do anything because they want to be, they want to be part of the police force, and they're afraid, maybe I'm not saying it right, but they're afraid to step up. And we have to give them the power to be able to step up so things don't happen like what happened with your nephew, Doris, and others. Um, and I'm from Philly, and I came up when Rizzo regime, and everything that I knew about police, that they would, anytime we got arrested, I knew I was getting a beating. Um, but we have to be more attentive to the community. We have to be more attentive to the trainings that they need. Um, I'm telling you, for me, this de-escalation. I'm not so, I'm I'm not so much sold on social workers riding with them, because I was talking to Mickey the other day. Because soon as the social worker, comes into a situation and they're shot or something happens bad, that's the end of that. You know, and I hate to even think about something bad would happen, but those are the consequences of being in, being involved in those different situations. We just had to make sure that they had the proper protections for them. When we talk about defunding the police, um, I have said countless of times to people, okay, so what are you gonna put with it? What's in its place? You put something in its place and it could be worse than what we have. We have to do something. And I never believed that I would be the one to say this, but we have to have something in place, so that crime just doesn't happen all the time, and that people feel comfortable in their community. I believe in community. I am definitely a part of the community, and we should listen to the community. The community can dictate a lot of different things that go on. Just in my work, um, the most influential people that I go to in the community are those grandmothers or somebody's mother. They can tell me who I need to talk to. If I say I need to talk to these boys, that you talk to every day, she said, what time you want to be here? What time are you going to be here? I'll have them all here. You know, those are the people that I have faith in, that are from the community. They're not politicians, but they are the people who actually can turn a community around from the violence that we see that happens in the Black and brown communities on a daily basis. Um, you know, I know that's something that you know, some of the police, when they see me come into the community, they leave. I don't want them to leave sometimes, but it's because of the presence that we have in the community that we have to get back to when we talk about different community policing. And I've never been a fan of police, just so you know. But you know, I know that there's an end, well, a means to the end that we have to work in conjunction together. If we're gonna change this whole system, this is what we have to do. And I take it through a public health approach. Um, and one of that is like one of the things that I try to address with violence is changing community norms. And with people like me, identity transformation, um, giving them a second chance, giving them a feeling where they can feel good about themselves. I'm actually started a reentry program where I'm working with men and women coming out of the state penitentiaries, training, getting them opportunities, um, changing the face of the community. That's what we have to do. We have to change this narrative. The same way with police. You know, I didn't want to, after Keegan and Darth, those was two hard acts to follow. I will never do that again, though. But you know, I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that I'm doing here in Pittsburgh, and I hope, Mickey, this is what you wanted me to do.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate meeting the two of you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So, Richard, you emphasized for me that the importance of community. I mean, that you know, it's kind of a social work version of all politics is local. I mean, that is where change starts. It's in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And I think that's really, really important that you focused on that. So thank you for doing that. And, you know, I think your perspective is so unique because you can see all sides of the picture. Yes, you know, of course, what's going to happen if we don't have any more police? That's something we would really need to think about. Although I don't think, though, that the defund the police movement in most cases really means that. I think it means realign, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you. You know, the word de-escalation has come up several times. And I do want to note also that Black Women for Positive Change has been helping Gwen Moore, Congresswoman in Wisconsin, get funding for a de-escalation bill. Like it's been going on for the last year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So focus was kind of taken away from that a bit because of the you know, everything that happened since George Floyd was murdered. And now everybody's talking about de-escalation. And Richard, you mentioned it too. Everybody mentioned it. Yeah.
One of the other things that I forgot to mention was the demilitarizing of the police. We have to do that. Just here in Pittsburgh, they protests. They had some officers arrest some protesters. They got them. You know, they were in their military gear. You know, and snatch them up and put them in the van and shoot them away. The whole thing about rubber bullets, flashbang grenades, you know, to stop using those in the protests. those are all some of the recommendations that came out of our group as well. Um, but you know that is huge because they think that they are the old school police officers, you know, think that they are above the law. You know, we have to change that mentality. And I
I
don't
have a
want to.
question. This is Diane. Has the conversation around police reform become too politicized? And if yes, how can the community regain control of the conversation?
That's a good question, and I think that it has become politicalized. You know, to a degree. Um, People, you know, our leadership has to be able to stand up and really start making things happen. I am, I am, just so you know, I'm deaf on our 5 Black elected officials. You know, we have to hold them, we have to hold their feet to the fire. Um, you know, that's the only way that things are going to change. You know, we have to hold our politicians to another level of accountability um, with passing some of these laws. You know, and making them find. You know, there's money that they put in different things for different the different initiatives. They need to be more community based with people who understand what the complexity of their community is. I think that that's another thing that we have to do.
Um,
Thank you. And then it looks like someone has raised their hand in the chats for questions. So Dr. Stephanie Myers, I'll go ahead and unmute your microphone if you want to ask a question.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. Do you think that we should institute a nationwide effort to train people in de-escalation of violence skills, training people at the school level, students, teachers, nurses, faith leaders, business leaders? Should we make this a nationwide effort to train people in de-escalation of violence?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I'm sorry for not, you know, really, when we're now talking about de-escalation, Dr. Myers, I think we're focusing on the police, but you're so right. I mean, we all need to be trained in that, you know, non-confrontative, non-violent way of resolving conflict for sure. So I'm all for that too.
One of the things that I also wanted to make clear to folks, the only, you know, if we just thought about uh like your nephew being killed and we talk about George Floyd and others, this has been going on for years.
Ever.
The only thing that has changed this, that has brought this thing to light, is these cell phones. You know, we have not heard from a lot of families, mothers, dads who have lost their lives because of police misconduct and things like that. So we are fortunate that we're in the environment that we are in today, that we can see exactly what's been going on for years. And we are in a place where we can really change some things. Um, so it's not just de-escalation training. I think training period, they have to go, a lot of police officers have to go through, not for an hour. It should be a continuous thing that they go through in order to serve the communities that they serve.
Yeah. And another thing that hasn't come up at all, we talk about trauma as it relates to people who have been harmed, but you know, I often wonder, police have to be traumatized too. I mean, when you think about, you know, like the young little 1-year-old baby that was shot up in, you know, here on the north side about 6 months ago or so, can you,
Yeah.
like the police that responded to that, that saw that baby dying, they have to be traumatized. And, you know, there needs to be policies and procedures in place to help police officers too that are suffering from trauma. Because if you're suffering from trauma, your body and mind go into hyperactivity, you know, whenever there's a perception of threat, be it real or not. So I think we should focus some dollars too on helping police through their trauma. That might result in a lot less of their knee-jerk reactions. Like, you know, Keegan, when you were saying believe, you know, you use the word believed to be, you know, imminent or whatever. There's a lot to be said for that. Belief can be so blown out of proportion if someone is reacting from a vigilant trauma base. Yeah.
You know, Mickey, I absolutely agree with you that um, I do believe that the majority, and I'm going to say majority, I'm not going to say mass majority as I almost did, but the majority of police officers are good and they want to do the right thing. And when they see it, when they see bad things happening, or as to your point, when they have to respond to something so horrific, that is traumatizing. And I do think that they do need help. And the other area of trauma that I want to discuss that I forgot to mention was when we, you know, Richard said, you know, that the difference now is the cell phone and the fact that we are experiencing it as it's happening. And that's not just traumatizing to the families, that's traumatizing to all of us. When we watched for, they initially they said it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and then they revised it to 7 minutes and 46 seconds. I don't care if it was a minute and 46 seconds, but that knee on that man's neck was traumatizing to all of us. When I saw those babies face down on the ground screaming, that traumatized me. So I can't, so you're gonna talk about hopes and prayers and getting them help. How about affecting change so that we can all feel safer? That's
Yeah.
what this is all about.
Yeah.
I just wanted to offer one thing. When Doris was, you know, giving all of these examples of kind of the perpetuation of violence continuing even after a law was passed, I just wanted to note one thing that Colorado did that not many states have done yet, and it's they created this civil cause of action against a police officer whose actions deprive, you know, a civilian of their rights as written by the Colorado Constitution. And so all of that is to say that if a police officer chooses to, you know, commit a crime, or if it's found to be a crime against somebody, they're not even able to use the qualified immunity defense in Colorado. So, you know, qualified immunity is largely like a federal concept and a federal defense, which has shielded a lot of police officers from accountability. So at every time we are for removing qualified immunity and letting police officers be able to be held accountable as individuals, for their actions. In fact, the best case of you know, ending qualified immunity is ensuring that you know, typically when a police officer is sued, the law enforcement agency, or as, you know, Doris and Richard have mentioned, taxpayers remain responsible for that debt. But this a sense of not allowing police officers to be indemnified, or just like a fancy word for like seeking cover through other, like making them personally responsible for the you know, financially responsible for their actions should they violate someone's civil rights. So that's something interesting that Colorado is doing. Connecticut tried to do it. They didn't do it as well as Colorado did it. They have this provision which basically relies on the officer's good faith, right? It goes back to this belief, this like subjective test. Like if the officer in good faith thought that what they were doing was not wrong, then that's a defense to them having to be held accountable. I don't think that your good faith belief is important in Colorado. I could be wrong to say Colorado is not one of my states, but that was something else I wanted to bring up, that, you know, a really robust police reform policy could include that at the end of the day, if you know, strengthening use of force standards don't work, if training doesn't work, if a sense of community doesn't work, if, you know, there is accountability through civilian review boards that are ineffective, and a special prosecutor chooses not to prosecute, then you can be held liable. Somebody can sue you, and somebody can win. And so that is another way to kind of like attack it from all areas, to hold police officers responsible for behavior. So I'm sorry I left that part out, but I thought it was helpful to know about our conversation in Colorado.
Thank you.
There was one other thing that you reminded me of, Keegan, and that was, and I have to give Colorado credit for this as well. One of the things that contributed to my nephew's death was, even though he was laying on the ground, he was subdued and was not moving much, as you could see in the video, they shot him up with 500 milligrams of ketamine. And to this day, I still don't understand why. And so that, and that call, and they said that typical dosage would be 25 milligrams, and they shot him 500. And so he had 2 heart attacks on the way to the hospital. And so and from the day that he died, there was a small contingent of people that supported him that went to the city council meeting every single week from the day he died to present. And they made sure that they were advocating on behalf of him. And the city council just recently banned the use of ketamine in an environment like that. So I have to give them credit for doing that.
So it feels to me like we're winding down here. I would just like to say a few words, and then Diane, I'm going to invite you to come on and say the official goodbye, because this is your week of nonviolence.
Okay.
I just want to thank everybody for their expertise, for their insight, for their values, for their willingness to, you know, share their stories. It's just been really overwhelming for me and remarkable. There are ways, this is being recorded, there are ways that it can be viewed. I can provide the details for that later, but we can post it on our personal Facebooks. Diane, you can post it on, you know, yours, etc. And we'll get you the details of that. So, I mean, I do have closing thoughts. I think, you know, Richard, I agree with you. We have an opportunity now. We've all become quite aware of what's going on, that has been going on, you know, you said for years, it's more like for centuries, I guess. But, you know, now we have the proof. Doris, you know, you mentioned those supporters of your great nephew who went every day to city council. That tells me we need to be vigilant. We cannot drop our guard. We have to remain vigilant. We have to keep saying their names. But it does give me hope that so many states, and even the city of Pittsburgh, and we're waiting with bated breath, Richard, for the release of that report, there has been legislation enacted. But vigilance, I think, comes into play because laws don't mean doo-doo, you know, unless they're implemented. So I think, you know, that's another thing we need to really be vigilant about. So again, and the importance of community, obviously, you know, and I think there's an opportunity for us to advocate. That's a really important word on many different levels. So those are my parting thoughts for today. I'm just so gratified that you all shared so much of your experience and expertise. Of course, you'll be called upon again to do it in the future, I'm sure. But, you know, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. And Diane, I'll give you the last word.
I just wanted to direct everyone's attention to the link that has been posted in the chat box. Please visit www.weekofnonviolence.org, not only for the upcoming workshops for our 9th annual Week of Nonviolence, but also please take the time to complete a survey that we have posted on that link. We're trying to get information and gather data on attitudes and perceptions about violence in respective communities. And we're doing that around the country. So your input would be extremely valuable. I ask that you take a few minutes and complete the survey on our behalf. But I also wanted to thank each and every one of you for the time that you've devoted to this session. It was extremely educational and informative. We're definitely going to post it on our Facebook page and direct traffic to that so that other people will have an opportunity to hear the recommendations and the experiences that you shared today. Bring other people along with you in this movement to change the culture of violence in our country. We have so much work to do. There's so many layers to unravel, but I am encouraged by the work that's being done. The attention that's being paid to the initiatives that are bubbling up from the surface in respective communities. So keep doing what you're doing and remember to support one another. Thank you, Moms Demand Action, for the funding to do this event. Nikki, you did an outstanding job. Megan, thank you for your help and look forward to working with you guys in the future.
Okay.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.